Hi, sir. David Rudd. I'm at the SJS on the 13th floor there. I'm going to try to answer your question. I don't think that's
Just a second, I want to take notes.
I don't think that's the basic problem of populism. I think that the challenge of convincing our publics to put forth the resources and the brain power to contain, deter, whatnot, that's a problem in all the democracies right now, not just the ones who are succumbing or seem to have succumbed to populism. It's hard to have a conversation in Germany right now about defense spending and especially about, let's say, renewing the tactical nuclear deterrent. And I don't see a lot of activity in our own parliament, to go by what's in the media, about these issues. And if I may say so, when Strong, Secure, Engaged came out, I found the assessment of the global context, and especially the return of great power politics, the role of China, I found the language to be extremely restrained, perhaps too much so. Kennan was not so restrained. He went right to the point because he felt he needed to. The stakes were that high. If the stakes are as high as our panelists have led on today, then I think we need to have a very, very tough conversation with ourselves in our own parliaments, and our leaders can't shy away from that. So that's a challenge that is not unrelated to, but I think has to be done regardless of whether or not populism is a factor or not.
So
thank you.
Thanks for that. Not really a question, but let me respond to a couple of the other points. I take your point about the challenge being the same in democracies all over the world, regardless of whether or not they seem to be wrestling with populism. I do think, though, that there is a difference between addressing the issue in the context of a country where you've still got a tremendous commitment to multilateral solutions and a buy-in. And I'm thinking, of the attitude we find in, say, some of the forward states in Eastern Europe, some of the easternmost NATO members, where there's a very strong commitment and buy-in to the principles of multilateralism, a very strong commitment to NATO adhesion. I remember being in a discussion at NATO when we were setting up the enhanced forward presence, and we were debating it. And the question arose, did we have to describe the troops that were going to be posted there as permanent? And one of the Baltic countries was saying, yeah, they had to have the word permanent. And the chairman said, well, could you accept any other word? And the Baltic guy thought about it for a while, and he said, well, if you can't accept permanent, I would live with eternal. He said, or we could just say, so long as Russia exists. So that's one attitude towards multilateral solutions, right? Compare that to the debate that you might have in a country that's just voted for Brexit, right? And has just had a popular upheaval where it's expressing real doubt about submerging any element of its national sovereignty. There are two different contexts in which the debate's taking place in places like that. So I don't disagree with you. I think the challenge is everywhere, but I do think that the challenge is slightly different in some places than others. On the second half of your question about SSE and the strategic environment, I hear you. And one thing I would say is that when we were writing the defense policy strategic environment, there was an assumption as we were going through it and preparing, early drafts of it, that defense policy would open the same way defense policies normally open. If you take a look at the way we wrote them in the past, if you take a look at the defense policies that were produced in the 2 years before ours came out by the United Kingdom, by Australia and New Zealand, all three of which were very well received in their countries, and the first thing you notice is that strategic environment section that you want is the first chapter in the document. We assumed that ours was going to open the same way. We thought we would start with the strategic environment because that's the logical way to write a defense policy. Start with the strategic environment, and then you engineer the capacities and the people that you need to respond to the challenges that you're seeing on the horizon. In the final analysis, it didn't. If you actually look at the first chapter of the Canadian defense policy, it's all about people. It's about the people who are on the front lines of the Canadian forces and what we can do to give them greater support. That wasn't an accident. That's because as we held the public consultations and we heard more and the government listened, it came to the conclusion that it wanted to put the people first. So the document doesn't read quite the same way that a strategic document like a defense policy document like that would normally read. But it's not an accident. It's because the government was really attaching a lot of attention to how to take care of its people, and it was making some very specific commitments in there about increasing the size of the regular force, increasing the size of the civilian workforce, increasing the size of the reserves, building a transition unit so that people who at the end of the military year could transition more smoothly to being veterans. Those were all really important things that the government wanted to put in the window and highlight. The fact that the strategic environment's not at the beginning doesn't mean it's not important. It's just chapter 4 instead of chapter 1. I encourage you to read it. If the language isn't quite as de rigueur as you would prefer, I hear you. But it was a balancing act.
Since you mentioned the defense policy drafting process, I have a question about what led up to it, which is the consultations that took place across Canada with expert roundtables and so on.
Yep.
And I was just wondering from your department's perspective, what has that process been like, and what have been some of the takeaways from these broad consultations?
Yeah, so great question. So just a couple of comments about it. First of all, it was the most comprehensive review of Canadian defense policy in the history of the country. And certainly the public consultation exercise was completely unprecedented. It was completely unprecedented in one sense because some of the means that we used to do that consultation didn't technologically exist the last time that we wrote the defense policy, right? So we had an online process which allowed people from coast to coast to weigh in and give us their comments. We sent out basic tombstone data about the Canadian forces and the way we work and how we've been funded over the years. Try and ensure the most informed possible level of public debate. And that online exercise proved to be really interesting. We got tens of thousands of people who weighed in. And we then complemented that with the series of roundtables we did all across the country. We did 6 generic ones, which we did coast to coast and up in Yellowknife, so that people could weigh in on any topic. And then we did 3 thematically specific ones where we wanted to do a little bit more of a deep dive. And we got a really great cross section of views on the topics. I would say that there were slightly different messages. If you had to pick an overriding theme of what came out of the public consultations and what came out of the online consultations, I mean the personal ones, they weren't quite the same. In the online consultation, the major message that we got was the Canadian forces are under-resourced and they've been badly treated and they need to be better funded. That was the basic message. The overriding message that came out of the consultations with people, where we actually had experts sitting around roundtables and talking to us, was the Canadian forces need to understand that they're not alone. They're part of a whole of government effort in a security environment that doesn't allow for military approaches to be standalone anymore. They have to work much more in an integrated, coordinated way with law enforcement and other elements of our national government. So 2 slightly different themes, and I'm oversimplifying here because obviously there were a lot of different messages. The couple of comments on the 2 processes. The online one was really interesting because we couldn't control when we promoted it. widely, but we couldn't control who actually logged in. We could control who came to the public meetings, but we couldn't control who actually logged in and gave us comments. And a couple of things we noticed. People could log in anonymously. They also had the option of identifying themselves, and some people did that. For the people who commented online, an awful lot of them seem to have been associated with the Canadian Forces in some way or another. Some of them were serving members. They had every right to participate along with the rest of the public. Some of them were veterans. Some of them were families from the family members of people who had served in the Canadian Forces. So there seemed to be an element of that. One of my favorite comments left online was by a guy who wrote us a message that said, "The Canadian Armed Forces are the best in the world, and they deserve the very best available aircraft, ships, vehicles, and boots." And I had a feeling that that comment came from a guy who had actually walked a mile in our boots. So that gives you a flavor of it. The stuff that came on the other side, from the expert opinions, was varied, and it was different from place to place in the country, and I was surprised sometimes by the things that we heard. I was in one of the panel sessions, and there was a guy there, an academic, who I think thought he knew how the policy was going to turn out. And at one point he said, and this is almost a direct quote, he said, "The great thing about having the Canadian defense policy being principally concerned with peacekeeping in the future is that we won't have to worry about keeping pace with technological progress, which we couldn't afford anyway." And I remember hearing that statement, and my head sort of started to explode, right? Like there were so many elements of that were challengeable, and yet in his mind they were all assumed. So that was part of the debate. I was also amazed. I mean, there were regional differences that came up. I was also amazed that what was really important to Canadians wasn't necessarily what we thought it was going to be. I went to a roundtable in Edmonton. I was there at a time when our deployment in the Middle East, the guys we have who are serving in Iraq and Kuwait and are still there right now, were pretty much on the front page of the paper. We're in Edmonton, which has a fairly large expatriate Ukrainian community, and we have 200 troops in Ukraine right now. I assumed that we would have some kind of discussion of our international deployment. We were there all day, subject almost never came up. What people wanted to talk about was search and rescue, assistance to civil authority, fighting forest fires. Now, it might have helped that there was a huge forest fire going on just north of us at the time. And that was, and the health of the reserves, right? Because that's where they encountered the forces. They encountered them fighting fires. They encountered the reservists who lived in their community. Most of them had never been in the Middle East in their lives, right? So there was a real difference in what we thought was going to be a concern and what ended up being a concern. So I've probably given you way too complete an answer to that question, but it was a really fascinating exercise.